Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Hans-Georg Moeller. He is a professor in the Philosophy and Religious Studies program at the University of Macau. His research focuses on Chinese and Comparative Philosophy, specifically Daoism, and on social and political thought, specifically social systems theory. He is the author of several books, and today we're going to focus mostly on The Moral Fool, a case for amorality. So, Dr. Moeller, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so I would like to ask you first, why is it that in the book you refer to morality as a tool? What does that mean exactly?
Thereby, I mean that it is a tool for communication, a mode of speaking, basically. This is in the tradition of a few thinkers on morality, including Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, but I'm more influenced by the German social theorist Niklas Luhmann, who also defines morality in this way. So what does it mean? Well, traditionally, it was morality was supposed to be something like whatever quality of a human being, right? There are good and bad people, or the quality of an action, right? They're good and morally good and bad action, or the quality of a principle later on with thinkers like Kant or so, right? So if you can either have good or bad principles. But I think it makes more sense from a, let's say, to analyze morality in terms of a way of communicating in specific terms, namely in the terms good and bad in a moral sense, or as Wittgenstein says, in an absolute sense. So it's a specific way of using the terminology and the categories good and bad. That's how I would define it. And in this way, it is a tool for communication. You can do all kinds of things with using language in this way or with communicating in this way.
Mhm. So sometimes people commit atrocities in the name of morality, but since your book is about amorality, is that, I mean, the committing of atrocities a feature of morality itself, or do you think that when people do that, they are abusing morality?
Well, they are using it first and foremost, right? As you say in your question already, you commit atrocities in the name of it, right? And that basically describes a major phenomenon since ancient times that whatever you're going to war or you're doing some other acts of violence, but then you justify them with moral language because, you know, the other people were bad. So I think that's one of the prime usages historically, empirically, in actuality for morality. Now, that's a use, I think, factually, one of the major uses of morality, of moral language, of moral communication. If it is an abuse, well, that depends on the observer, right? There's a lot of, for instance, philosophy of just wars, right? So that's not one of the most famous is Michael Walzer, who wrote like in the 70s and 80s, well, not long ago, right? So they would then, whatever, also find out which war is just, right? So certain wars, even someone like Michael Walzer would say, well, in some cases, yeah, we have to, it's necessary and it's kind of morally good to commit violence. But then again, we use moral language in order to find out why it's good. So really, if you call something use or abuse, really depends on the position of the observer. But I think it is basically historical, sociological, linguistic, whatever fact that morality, moral language, moral communication has been used not only, but also, and importantly so, for such things as warfare and so forth. And if that's a use or an abuse, that depends on the observer. It's similar, whatever, uh, whatever. If you use a gun in war, is that an abuse of the gun, right? And some people would say, no, it's good because I do it to defend myself or my country or whatsoever. But it's a dangerous tool that can be used for all kinds of things.
Right. So, and with the uses people give to morality, would you say that morality plays mostly a role of providing people with rationalizations for their behavior, or is it also or mostly a source of motivation for people's behavior?
I think both. That is basically the same thing, right? It is a way in which you can, and again, empirically, historically, right? You justify certain social conventions, uh, whatever, marriage, right? And then you have certain, it is immoral to whatever commit adultery, as it then called, right? And then you can go a step further, and that's why it is okay if we stone the person, stone to death the person who committed adultery, right? So that is something you can use morality to justify, let's say, not only social conventions, but basically, I would like to call it a kind of certain regimes of behavior, how you discipline behavior, which is of course necessary. Otherwise, you can't really have a functioning, highly complex society. And with a moral, if you use moral language to justify this, then this can be much more easily internalized by people, right? If you say adultery is simply bad, that is not as convincing or as deterring as if you say it's a great sin and you go to hell if you do it. Right. So, in this sense, if you make people feel like morally bad about these things, that's a powerful way of disciplining people.
Yeah. So could you tell us what is the moral fool? I mean, basically the title you give to your book.
Yes, that's the attempt to not take morality that seriously and to not overly use moral language. And mostly probably that's what the moral fool to to not really believe too deeply to have moral knowledge, to possess moral knowledge, to be capable of really distinguishing in the correct way between good and evil, right? That's the moral fool is basically someone who is neither doesn't claim to be able to, but also doesn't aspire to use the terms good and evil in the correct way, and who prefers, in this sense, moral foolishness over moral smartness.
So that is the same as amorality. Right?
That is true. That's morality, but that's amorality. But of course, like, and I point out, and it's very difficult, like, to be fully amoral. I don't claim to be like fully amoral, but to be less and less of what, let's say, a moral fundamentalist, to not take my own moral inclinations too seriously, not to fully trust them.
And I mean, do you
Try not
think,
morally judgmental as much as possible.
right? And do you think that people in their normal everyday lives that they really think and act morally? I mean, do you think that they take into account the moral knowledge, or I mean, do you think that they think in moral terms when they behave?
Well, mostly I don't think that is so, and that is also something that you find, for instance, in Niklas Luhmann's work, the sociologist I mentioned, but also even in Daoism, which I'm influenced in, the idea that in everyday situations, morality isn't really that much needed, right? So, right, whatever, we're communicating now without morally judging one another very seriously. But before we started the recording, we were having some small talk, and there wasn't really much. We were talking, as is probably normal, about the COVID-19 situation and so forth, and we were not morally judging anyone. And so the communication was still meaningful, and it was friendly and so forth. So it is perfectly possible to have communication without a high degree of moral intensity, and to still interact in a nice way. And actually that happens most of the time. And like Niklas Luhmann, a sociologist, says, it's kind of typically much more a symptom, an indicator of conflict, right? When we switch to moral evaluations, and then that usually indicates that somehow something has already gone wrong. And that's basically the same attitude that you already find in the Taoist texts, in the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, which are more than 2,000 years old. They basically say the same thing. All these moral categories that are around, people pretend they are needed to make things work smoothly and nicely. But in fact, it seems rather the opposite, that it is a terminology that is only then made much use of when things are already going wrong the wrong way. So that seems to be, they are much less a solution to a problem rather than a symptom of a problem.
So, since you mentioned Taoism, could you tell us a little bit more about what were the main philosophical sources from which you derived this concept of the moral fool and your ideas about amorality?
Well, at the beginning, I already mentioned Luhmann and Wittgenstein, but as I just said, maybe even more importantly, or at least as much as important as Luhmann, is my background in Taoist philosophy. So I mentioned these two core texts, Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching, which probably most of your listeners will at least somehow have heard. This is one of the, next to Confucius, Lao Tzu, one of the most well-known philosopher of ancient Chinese philosopher. And so there's this small book, Tao Te Ching, or Lao Tzu is the presumed author, but probably just a legendary figure. And that's highly influential and translated in basically most of the languages, and quite famous book, and it's more than 2,000 years old, and contains the basics of Taoist philosophy, if you want. And then there's a little bit later this text Zhuangzi, which is much longer, and it has all kinds of stories in it, and that's kind of an exposition and an extension of Taoist philosophy. And so one, I think, a central aspect of Taoism is that it is a reaction to Confucianism. And Confucianism is, one way to understand it, is kind of the dominant mainstream philosophy of early China. And even until today, it's still very influential. So its role can be compared, whatever, to the role of Christianity in the Western tradition, right? Even though it predates Christianity. So it's and like Christianity, it has strong both philosophical and moralistic components and religious components. And Taoism already in this early stage developed in parts as a critique of Confucianism. And one aspect of this critique, I think, is a critique of, let's say, the moral pathologies created by Confucian ethics, right? Whatever the kind of stress it creates, and the kind of the kind of person, the overly moralistic person is somehow, from a Taoist perspective, somehow a crippled person. If you cultivate yourself overly as a moralist, you become more and more stiff, like whatever the analogy that you find, for instance, in the Zhuangzi is the domestication of animals, right? So you have whatever horses or wolves, and then you domesticate them in order to do them something good. But as an effect, you just take out their kind of natural strength, and their natural whatever power is diminished. You diminish their life force, and in somewhat in a similar way, morality is somehow seen as a form of crippling of people. And so that's a central idea that you find in Daoism, and that is then explored in all kinds of different ways.
Mm-hmm. And what is the difference between amorality and immorality?
Well, immorality basically means to act intentionally in a non-moral way,
Mm-hmm.
that you somehow accept the distinction, but at the same time don't mind doing something that is evil, or enjoy doing something that is evil, right? And of course, that's very different from being amoral, right? Amoral, just as mentioned earlier, means to just try to not be overly morally judgmental, but to think and communicate in different ways, and not to whatever enjoy doing bad things.
Right. But do you think that it is possible for anyone to live without any morality whatsoever?
No, I don't really think. I mean, morality is such a central communication tool again, that it's part of our thinking, that it's difficult kind of to imagine not to use it. But I think we can still, and I think in one example that I use, for instance, in the book, is whatever in the legal system. Is still an example that I like to use. That was kind of influential for me. Even at that time, I was still very young, like a teenager or so.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this. I like to watch this. It was kind of a documentary TV show on German TV in the 1970s, Ehen vor Gericht. Even though I was a teenager, I watched this, and this means marriages at court. And it was about, so it was all just real cases, not like these Judge Judy show or so in the US. So it's like a long time ago, and it was just a report on these, on some cases. And always the point at that time in marital law and divorce cases was to find out who is guilty, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, who had cheated on the other person. And then the person who was guilty would have to pay a lot, and the other, and then it had a lot of financial and so forth consequences. And then German divorce law, like I guess in most other countries, was drastically changed by simply no longer asking that question, who is guilty? Mm-hmm. And that was much more practicable. So the morality was taken out of the law and out of divorce law. And I think that made, that was socially much beneficial. It wasn't good for the show, because the show then made no sense, and then the TV show disappeared, right? Because of the spectacularity of the show was precisely based on its moral component. And I think similar things have happened. Another thing that I discuss in the book, also having to do with law. In America, the death penalty for moral reasons, right? They say the death
Mm-hmm.
penalty is morally necessary because of retribution, which is a moral duty. This goes back to the philosopher Kant and others. So, um, particularly in death penalty cases, there is a strong emphasis on morality in the court cases. Again, I watch a lot of documentaries on this. And usually what it really plays a major role is to prove to the jury, because these are still trials by jury mostly, how bad the offender is, morally bad. And in this way, the prosecution, I think this is one of the main reasons why there is a surprisingly high number of wrong death penalty verdicts, right, where the person is actually not guilty. But through moral language, the jury is basically forced to develop kind of moral anger against that person, and then this morality overcomes their amoral judgment of simply the facts of the case, right? So that's another thing, I think, where the European system, which is much less morally charged, right? Also, for instance, in Germany, in the media, it is when you have crime reports, you're usually not supposed to mention the name of the offender. I don't know how is that in Portugal.
I'm not sure. I never participated in that
But
sort of thing.
in America, you always hear the name, and that's considered to be, you have to do this because of the shaming element. So right, if there's someone who commits a crime, then the Americans think it's very important to mention this name publicly so that the person can be morally shamed. Whereas in Germany, precisely because they think, oh, there's too much moral shaming going on, and we just want to report the facts, but not the name of the person who committed the crime. And so that's another aspect. I think that's another concrete example where kind of society in law progresses from using less and less morality. But that doesn't mean that they don't, that they don't make, they replace basically what morality does with legal procedures. These legal procedures can include punishment in the case of crimes, but they can also, like in the divorce case, just decriminalize certain things and replace them with certain legal procedures that deals with the divorce, with the splitting up of two partners, maybe in a better way than a more moral way of dealing with this, right? So, and that's like a core argument that I make, that often, for instance, a legal way of dealing with this is actually somehow better, not in a moral sense, because it's less moral, than dealing with things morally, right? And then divorce is one example. I think it's better to deal with a divorce in an amoral rather than in a moral way in many ways. And there, I could give you more example, but we don't have that much time.
Yeah, but are systems of law fundamentally moral?
Well, they used to be, of course, a lot of them also traditionally were fundamentally religious, right? That was the idea in the medieval times and so forth, that law was basically grounded in divine laws, right? And then this has been replaced, becomes more secular in moral laws. But I think, and that's what I take from the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, increasingly just law becomes autopoietic, based on itself, and derives legal laws just out of legality. So just as it kind of gets rid of its theological, has basically gotten rid to a large extent in Western nations, at least from its theological grounding, I think it can also move away. I'm not sure if it does from a moral grounding.
So, talking about moral fools and amoral people, I mean, I was just trying to understand if there's a minimum set of moral traits that people would have to keep for them to behave in a proper way. Let's say, I didn't want to use good or bad, those kinds of terms here, but I mean for them to not do bad deeds, basically. So, for example, do you think that people should still distinguish between good and bad, and or good and evil people?
I think as I said, I think it's much better to whatever distinguish in from a legal perspective between criminals and not criminals and define what is criminal and not criminal. Another example I like to give usually is education, right? In traditional education, it was still a bad student was also considered a bad person. There was somehow to be something morally wrong with the person. We don't really do that anymore. We also, which I find equally important, don't really think that good students are necessarily good persons, or that a good student is necessarily a better person than a bad student, right? Yeah. So a good student is just a good student. Right, but that doesn't mean that we can no longer distinguish between good and bad students, which makes a lot of sense, right? But we don't have to use the category morally as in the past, right? And I think we can even do so, whatever, in other things, like a good friend. A good friend also doesn't necessarily, can just be a good friend, or a good father can be a good father. That's to be whatever, like a good father will be someone, or a good friend, someone who cares and someone who is affectionate and all these kind of things, which are qualities that are very important to be like a nice person. But that doesn't really have to be overly moralized, right? I mean, look, and also traditionally, a good father, according to traditional morality, was maybe a father who beats his children a lot, right? Or who is very strict in. Again, that is. I think we can just like find out more. Directly, we don't have to what is like whatever good or bad in whatever, with respect to legal distinctions, with respect to education, with respect to partnerships, or with respect to parenting and so forth. And we don't have to impose like a moral terminology on this. And then maybe we can even say, let's say, a father who isn't very affectionate or kind is not necessarily a bad person, but is maybe someone who has a certain emotional deficiency or so, right? And maybe he's incapable of being very affectionate or very kind, and we can make whatever a psychological assessment, and then we can find out, yeah, he's not good as a father, but he's not necessarily a bad person, therefore, right? And we can say, yeah, I mean, unlucky if you're the child of that guy. Because but that doesn't mean that the person is in a moral sense a bad father. But he is a bad father, right? I mean, you'd rather have a father who is affectionate than one who is not affectionate. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes a lot of sense to call the one father a bad person and the other father a good person.
Mm-hmm. Is the concept of moral responsibility important for you? I mean, do you have any account of it, and does it have a place in an amoral philosophy?
Again, I give you the same answer. I think responsibility is very important. I just wouldn't want to call it moral responsibility, right? Again, like whatever. Legal responsibility, I think, is very important. Otherwise, you can't have a functioning society in today's. As a teacher, I have to be somehow responsible, right? I have to come to class. I have to be somehow fair to my students, not be corrupt. and things like this, right? So of course, and then again, in a partnership, whatever, if your father is it's important to be responsible, and so forth and so forth. So again, but I think we can be much more precise with regard to responsibility, and we can define and understand what responsibility consists in without defining this in moral terms. So yes, I think responsibility, of course, is important, but I wouldn't necessarily call it moral responsibility.
I understand. Does amorality go hand in hand with some form of moral anti-realism, like, for example, moral relativism or moral nihilism or any other version of it?
I think it goes along somewhat, not fully with any of what you mentioned, right? Because moral relativism, simply put, means that um, uh, there is that morality is good, except that relative to certain circumstances, right? But I think it doesn't really mean it doesn't really matter this kind of relativity, right? Um, I don't think whatever, just that. Different cultures, whatever, have different moralities, and then to say that's just fine, right? I think in each culture, morality is a problem, and so also relative morality is a problem, just as universal morality is a problem, and then also moral nihilism doesn't really fully fit what I'm trying to say with amorality. I'm not really trying to say, you can do whatever you want. That's not really the point. I'm just saying morality is not really something that I think there are a lot of problems attached to morality, and so I think amorality is really the best category for this kind of project.
Do you think that religion, when it comes to morality, is especially problematic? Because, I mean, we tend to find religious systems going hand in hand with lots of moral fervor. For example,
Right.
do you think it is especially problematic, or any other ideological system like political or something
Yeah.
like that that goes associated together with a moral system is equally problematic?
Yeah, there is again historically, empirically, a close connection between religion and morality, right? And we can basically say that religion's kind of, I would say, kind of monopolizes morality, right? And that is especially problematic. I was just reading up on Wikipedia for some other thing on the Ten Commandments today, right? And of course, these Ten Commandments, on the one hand, they are like certain general moral rules that are more or less universal, right? You shouldn't kill, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't commit adultery. But this is then in the Ten Commandments tied to a religious, and it becomes the same, right? You should only believe in one God, and you shouldn't use the name of the Lord in vain, and so forth, right? So this becomes, morality becomes, on the one hand, tied to like a specific kind of transcendent, whatever, this kind of God-like religious figure, which makes it even more kind of powerful. And yeah, so that is I think problematic. Where was I going? And there was another thing I wanted to say, but it's kind of and it's monopolizing it in the sense that, for instance, then what we have in Christianity, right? That whatever love and care, right, which is Christianity emphasizes a lot, which are of course nice things, but they become kind of monopolized. That out of the Christian, out of the religious culture, the religious system, the religious conventions, love and care become kind of worthless. So it's a monopolization of certain of morality that is also kind of very, very problematic. And then if someone's not a Christian, you don't have to love them anymore, right? You can actually kill them in history, right? Not every theologian, most Christian theologians would not necessarily make that point, but in practice, that was exactly what was practiced, right? Yeah, I think there's a kind of an unholy pact between religions and morality, and a kind of a monopolization of morality, because it's such a powerful tool, such a powerful communication tool and psychological tool.
Do you think that moral values compare in any way to other sorts of philosophical values, like epistemic values related to the truth, or aesthetic values related to the beautiful, for example? Do you think that we can establish comparisons there?
Yes, sure. But again, morality seems to be much more tied to conflict, right? I mean, there is less, I would say, conflict tied to differences regarding beauty or so, right? It's much more benign, much more harmless. Whereas moral values tend to be much more, I don't know, controversial and much more close to conflict and moral language, right? So it's not really the case that we kill one another over different over aesthetics, and not even over a not amoral truths, right? As long as we have different truth claims, and as long as they're not tied to morality, they seem to be able to coexist more easily, and also to advance, right? If you don't tie morality to certain truth claims, then it's easier to develop the truth claim and into something different. But if you have a certain moral conviction, like a religious conviction, it is difficult to let it go and replace it with something else.
Right. Is there anything like moral progress in the context of amorality?
It's a question I often ask myself, and it seems somehow so, right? It seems somehow that we have progress today, whatever. We don't have slavery anymore, and in the West, and whatever. Now we have all these kinds of human rights that weren't really, whatever, women's rights and sexual minorities and these kinds of things. But it's difficult to say. I mean, whatever, like, you know, in many ways you could also make the opposite claim, whatever. I mean, is Saudi Arabia more progressive because they have less abortion than morally more progress because they have less abortion than whatever, Portugal? I suppose there are less abortions in Saudi Arabia than in Portugal, right? It really depends on what kind of moral values that would be a reasonable claim, right? I mean, right, that you can say, or whatever, like a country like China has very little crime compared to the US. Is it therefore morally more progressed than the United States. It's very fishy to make these to make these claims about moral progress, because they are a kind of very, how to say, kind of tautological, right? Of course, a certain society tends to believe that its own moral values are superior to all other moral values. That's why they are our moral values. And so we've made progress towards the values that we have now. And so kind of every society kind of must say of itself that our moral values now are better than all the moral values we had before. So in this sense, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy to say that morality is somehow progressing, and that there is moral improvement or so. And yeah, I'm not sure that this is the case.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the role that moral philosophers play in society? I mean, do you think that the kinds of theories and ideas that they develop really have any relevant impact in how people conduct their lives or how societies function and stuff like that?
Well, they function a little bit not as powerful, but somewhat comparable to, again, like theologians, whatever, in medieval society, right? They provide you arguments and justifications and write treatises on and give reasons why the morality that we practice is correct, or how, in which way it should be improved. And so there's a kind of they provide kind of expert knowledge on how to make moral claims, right? And so in this sense, I think that it functions somewhat like theology, but it's not that powerful, maybe, as theology comparatively used to be. Interesting to see. There was an empirical study by an American philosopher. Eric Schwitzgebel is the name, German name, but he's American. And he sort of empirically found out that moral philosophers are not morally better than other people, which to me, of course, was no surprise at all, right? So he was just asking. I don't know exactly how he found this out, but something like he was just having like questionnaires sent to philosophy departments, and then asking people if they think that their colleagues who do ethics are nicer people than the colleagues who do other things. And so he found out there's no correlation, right? People who do ethics professionally are not nicer people than people who don't do ethics professionally. And I think, of course, again, like to me, that's no surprise at all, because what people who corresponds exactly to my main thesis, the first question you asked me, what is morality? It's a way of using language. They are better in using language, but they're not actually better people. Their character isn't better, nor are their actions better, nor are even their principles that if they have any that they follow. They're just better in moral communication, and they're providing a moral communication to society. And again, like this is similar to what theologians did, and it's similar to what they still do in Islamic societies, right? If you have like an Islamic republic or so, like in Iran or other Islamic countries, there the theologians are very powerful still, because they provide this kind of the kind of moral language as well. And I think, fortunately, the moral philosophers in our society don't really have the same power that the providers of moral language in religious autocracies have.
So, with that in mind, do you think that it makes sense when, for example, moral philosophers or ethicists stress that it's important for people to learn this sort of intellectual tools to learn how to, how to think about reasons, how to justify their behavior and things like that? I mean, do you think that that plays any important role in people becoming better people or not?
I somewhat, I somewhat agree with Sam Harris, right? Sam Harris, taught, the famous American thinker and writer, who thinks that we can use science to increase well-being. Now, he likes to call this morality. I just wouldn't call that morality. But I think whatever we can find out, as I said earlier, through all kinds of means, including scientific means, what is better, what increases well-being in a certain way, and what doesn't increase well-being in a certain way. Again, I think we can, but I don't think that is morality. I think that is fundamentally different from morality. So I disagree with Sam Harris to say that increasing well-being and morality is basically the same thing. Again, because I pointed out, I think morality is just a way of distinguishing between good and evil, and that is very different between distinguishing between well-being and specific forms of well-being, right? And also well-being is very, again, like it's also always, in a sense, relative, right? I can, whatever, like what increases economic well-being may not increase ecological well-being, right? What increases your health may not increase your enjoyment in life, right? As we see with COVID-19, right? So, there is no such thing as something that increases well-being in all respects and is therefore the morally best thing to do. But this is somehow the idea of morality and inquiries into morality, that we can, as Ludwig Wittgenstein would call it, find out what is absolutely best. Now, you asked earlier about relativism. Now, I'm not saying that which is normally understood. Oh, morality is relative because in one culture this is morally good, and another culture that's not what I mean to say. Like, it's relatively good to have certain whattever COVID-19 restrictions to increase well-being in the sense that less people die. Right? That's somehow good for well-being, but somehow it's not good for well-being that less people die of COVID-19. But in in another respect, that's not good, because you have more people who become alcoholics because they can't leave home and sit at home and start drinking more and more, right? Because they're in quarantine, or they lost their job because of the economy and so forth. So it's very difficult to say that this kind of measure is well-being is always very relative. Right. So again, like the COVID-19 quarantine measures and so forth, they may increase well-being in one respect, namely less death of COVID-19, but they may actually make well-being worse, that you have more cases of alcoholism. And so is therefore quarantine a good thing or a bad thing? Right. And is it morally good or bad? That's really something I think that we shouldn't approach. It doesn't really make much sense to approach such questions from moral perspectives, right? Right. So, with COVID-19 measures, we shouldn't ask ourselves, is it morally good or bad to have quarantine measures, right? But we can ask ourselves, in how far does it increase well-being? And there are so many ways in which it increases well-being, but there are also so many other ways in which it doesn't increase well-being. And then then we can try to come to some informed conclusion on what to do. but moral reasoning regarding it doesn't really help very much, I think. I don't think the moral philosophers can help us very much with approaching these or any other question that is relevant today.
Mm-hmm. But on that point, even if, for example, we develop sufficiently good enough scientific tools to know what produces more well-being or reduces suffering, for example, I mean, for us to want to pursue those things, aren't we lacking some sort of ethical argument there? I mean, isn't it the case that we have to value those things to pursue them?
Again, like sorry if I just repeat myself. I think no. I think this is kind of as I would call it, second coding superimposition of moral language that isn't helpful. It's the same thing as I said earlier with the legal things about divorce or with education and so forth. We don't really have to say this is a good student and therefore this is also a good person, or right, in a moral sense. And similarly, I think also with effects to well-being, I think we can understand, again, like whatever, drinking alcohol is bad for your well-being because it destroys your liver, but it is also sometimes good for your well-being because you know, it makes you more relaxed and makes you have if you have like a beer with your friends, it makes you know, it helps you to whatever get more joyful with one another. And so in this sense we also, but you have to be careful with it, right? And it's very difficult, and our knowledge about it always changes, and there is no absolute, these things always change. But again, I don't think it helps us very much to find out if drinking alcohol is morally good or bad, ultimately. Right, but we can find out, for instance, in which ways it is good or bad for your body, or in which way it is good or bad socially, or in which it is good or bad psychologically. Mm-hmm. But if we find, and then we will find out it is good. It is both good and bad. In many ways, it is good, and in other ways, it is bad. So it has many good sides, but it also has many bad sides. And so that to kind of top this up with a moral judgment makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I understand it better now. So do you think that then moral philosophy and ethics, both academically and perhaps pragmatically, could be replaced with something else?
Yeah, I hope it like goes that way. And I mean, the first thing is, of course, which is already always there. As I say, I think amorality goes back already to early Chinese philosophy, right? The Daoists were already amoralists who saw the potential pathological problems of overly engaging in moral language and of overly disciplining the population with moral discipline, right? So I do think it is very important to always be critical of too much moral language, and I think that's an important thing. And one way of doing this is philosophy. Other ways of doing this in life is through comedy, for instance. That has always been an important tool and also has thousands of years of history, right? So maybe we can somehow it's philosophy and amoral philosophy, and the critique of morality is one of the social methods by which to try to keep the effects of moral pathology to a minimum. But I'm not sure it's the best one. As I said already, whatever humor, comedy, or other forms of art as well, literature and so forth, and art in general, also with an emphasis on beauty that you mentioned earlier, may provide, strong alternatives to morality and to whatever a strictly moralist consciousness. Right? If we live in an overly moral society, we end up with some Afghanistan Taliban-like state where all artwork is destroyed, right? And where all humor is forbidden, and where all philosophy, except for moral philosophy, is outlawed, right? And so there you can already see how all these other forms like art, like amoral philosophy, like literature, like humor, are basically something like antidotes, counter forms of communication that minimize moral communication. And I think so any form of communication that just doesn't overly engage in moral communication has a potential to help us against too much moral communication and too serious moral communication.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Moeller, I know it's already very late there in Macau, so let's finish the interview here. I don't want to rob you of any more of your time. The book is again The Moral Fool, A Case for Amorality. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Actually, I also have a YouTube channel, Carefree Wandering, where I talk about related things. I talk about Sam Harris, and I have a second one where I don't talk, fortunately, that introduces Daoist stories. So I especially would like direct your viewers' attention to that. It's called Philosophy in Motion, and it animates stories from the Zhuangzi. And I really like that other channel because I don't speak on that channel, and the Taoist philosophy speaks for itself, and a lot of it is amoral. So thank you for mentioning this, Ricardo.
Yeah, of course, and thank you so much for your time, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. Please consider supporting my work if you like it. You will have links in the description box to Patreon and PayPal. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke, Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Erica Lenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colomba, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Ellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codriano, and Jason Party. Thank you for all.